The morning sun hadn't yet crested the horizon when Dr. Sarah Johnson stepped out of her front door, coffee in one hand, designer briefcase in the other. Her Mercedes gleamed in the pre-dawn light, a symbol of 15 years of hard work and sacrifice that some people in her neighborhood still couldn't quite accept. She'd moved into this affluent suburb of Boston 3 years ago, after being appointed head of emergency medicine at Memorial Hospital. It was the kind of neighborhood where property values were discussed like weather forecasts and security cameras outnumbered children. The kind of place where a single black woman in a luxury car still turned heads, and not always in a good way. But Sarah wasn't just any doctor. Behind her carefully maintained professional facade lay years of meticulous documentation, countless hours of community organizing, and a position on the Civilian Police Oversight Committee that very few people knew about. Every morning, she drove to work with 2 dashcams running and a digital voice recorder in her pocket. Some might call it paranoid. Sarah called it preparation. Her neighbors saw what they wanted to see, a successful doctor who had made it despite the odds. They nodded politely at neighborhood meetings, made small talk about property taxes, and occasionally let their surprise show when they learned she lived alone in the 4-bedroom colonial with a perfectly manicured lawn. "You bought this place yourself," was a common refrain, usually followed by, "How impressive." What they didn't see were the 3 degrees hanging in her home office, the published research papers, or the awards for medical excellence. They definitely didn't see the carefully organized files on her home computer. Documentation of every random traffic stop, every routine police interaction, every subtle and not so subtle incident of profiling in their supposedly progressive community. Sarah had learned early in life that success wasn't just about individual achievement. It was about creating change that rippled outward. Her position at Memorial Hospital wasn't just a job, it was a platform. Her seat on the Oversight Committee wasn't just a responsibility, it was a weapon against injustice. As she pulled out of her driveway that morning, Sarah noticed Mrs. Henderson from next door watching through her curtains, phone in hand. It was a familiar sight. 3 years, and some neighbors still treated her presence like a neighborhood watch alert waiting to happen. She checked her rearview mirror, a habit born of necessity, and saw Officer Mike Patterson's patrol car idling at the corner. He'd been there more mornings than not lately, ever since she'd questioned his conduct at last month's Oversight Committee meeting. The message was clear. He was watching, waiting for her to make even the smallest mistake. What Officer Patterson didn't realize was that Sarah had been watching too. Each morning he followed her, each time he randomly appeared on her route to work. It all went into her files. Every interaction was recorded, every pattern documented. She was building something larger than herself, piece by piece, day by day. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Rivera, her colleague in the ER. "Heads up, 3 cases of police roughness came through last night, all black or brown victims, all from the same precinct." Sarah's jaw tightened. Patterson's precinct. The same one she'd been investigating for months. She typed back a quick response. "Document everything. Send me the files." As she merged onto the highway, Sarah's mind was already racing ahead. Today was supposed to be routine. Morning rounds, 2 scheduled surgeries, an afternoon of administrative work. But she'd learned long ago that change rarely announced itself in advance. It came in unexpected moments, in seemingly routine encounters that suddenly crystallized into something larger. She didn't know it yet, but this ordinary Tuesday was about to become one of those moments. The confrontation that had been brewing for months was about to boil over, and Sarah Johnson, doctor, activist, and secret architect of change, was more than ready for it. Looking in her rearview mirror again, she saw Patterson's patrol car pull onto the highway 3 cars behind her. Right on schedule. She smiled slightly, checking that both dashcams were recording. Sometimes the best weapon against systemic injustice wasn't dramatic confrontation. It was patient documentation, careful preparation, and the wisdom to know exactly when to strike. The stage was set. The players were in position. and Sarah Johnson was about to show Officer Patterson and the entire department that they'd severely underestimated the quiet doctor who kept to herself and always drove exactly at the speed limit. The first indication that today would be different came when Officer Patterson's cruiser suddenly accelerated, weaving through traffic to close the gap between their vehicles. Sarah's hands tightened imperceptibly on the steering wheel, but her speed remained exactly at the limit. 65 miles per hour, not a fraction more. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Marcus, her contact at the ACLU. 3 new complaints filed against Patterson this week. All black women, all driving expensive cars. Patterns getting clearer. Sarah allowed herself a small, grim smile. Patterson was getting sloppy, his prejudices more obvious. Maybe it was the pressure from the Oversight Committee's investigation. Maybe it was simple arrogance. Either way, he was making mistakes, the kind that created paper trails. The cruiser's lights flashed to life behind her, red and blue strobes shattering the morning calm. Sarah activated her phone's voice recorder with a subtle tap as she pulled over. Both dash cams were already running, their tiny red lights reflecting reassuringly in her rearview mirror. Through that same mirror, she watched Patterson's approach. His walk was pure theater. The exaggerated swagger, the hand resting unnecessarily on his weapon, the mirrored sunglasses despite the early hour. It was a performance she'd seen before, one designed to intimidate. "License and registration," he barked, not bothering with any preamble. His tone carried years of assumed authority, of unchecked power. Sarah retrieved her documents with deliberate calm. "May I ask why you pulled me over, Officer Patterson?" His jaw tightened at her use of his name. "You were weaving between lanes." A lie, and they both knew it. Her dash cams would show her rock-steady progress in a single lane. But that wasn't the point. The point was power, his to make accusations, hers to endure them. Or so he thought. "I don't believe I was weaving, Officer Patterson," she said evenly. "In fact, I'm certain I wasn't. Just as I'm certain this is the 4th time you've pulled me over in 3 weeks, always on my way to work, always without cause." His hand tightened on his weapon. "Step out of the vehicle." "Before I do that," Sarah continued, her voice remaining professional, "I'd like to verify that your body camera is activated. Department policy requires." I said step out. Patterson's voice rose sharply, drawing attention from passing cars. Several slowed down, windows rolling down as phones emerged to record the scene. Sarah kept her movements slow and deliberate as she opened her door. In her mind, she was no longer just Dr. Sarah Johnson being harassed by a racist cop. She was every black woman who'd faced this kind of abuse, every driver who'd been profiled, every citizen who'd felt powerless against a badge and a gun. Face the vehicle, hands where I can see them. More cars were stopping now. Sarah recognized Mrs. Henderson's SUV pulling up, foam clearly recording through the windshield. Perfect. The more witnesses, the better. "Officer Patterson," Sarah said clearly, ensuring her voice would carry to the growing audience, "I want to confirm for the record that you're ordering me to assume a search position despite having no probable cause, no reasonable suspicion, and no evidence of any traffic violation. I also want to confirm that your body camera appears to be deactivated, in violation of Department Policy Section 47B. Patterson stepped closer, his breath hot on her neck. "You think you know the law. You think that fancy car and fancy job make you special." "No, Officer Patterson," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "What makes this situation special is that I've documented every illegal stop you've conducted in this neighborhood for the past 6 months. Every racial profile, every fabricated excuse, every disabled body camera. And I'm not the only one who has." She turned slowly to face him, noting how his hand still gripped his weapon. "Did you know that black women in luxury vehicles are 17 times more likely to be stopped in your patrol zone than any other demographic? Did you know that data is now part of an official Oversight Committee investigation?" Patterson's face flushed red, Around them, the crowd of onlookers had grown. Phones recorded from every angle. In the distance, a local news van had pulled up. Sarah recognized the reporter stepping out, someone she'd been quietly feeding data to for weeks. "You're interfering with a police officer," Patterson growled, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "No," Sarah corrected him. "I'm documenting a pattern of civil rights violations. And right now, you have a choice. You can either write me a ticket for this imaginary violation, which will be contested in court with extensive evidence, or you can return to your vehicle and we can both continue our days." The gathered crowd murmured. Someone called out, "We're all recording, officer." Another voice added, "We see you." Patterson's composure cracked further. This wasn't how these stops usually went. His targets weren't supposed to be this prepared, this confident, this public about his actions. "The Oversight Committee meets tomorrow," Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly to the cameras around them. "Your conduct was already on the agenda. Now it's going to be the main topic. And this footage, from multiple angles, will be Exhibit A." She gestured to the news van. "I believe Channel 5 would love your comment on why you've pulled me over 4 times in 3 weeks. Or perhaps you'd like to explain why your body camera is off. Or maybe you'd like to share your thoughts on the statistical analysis of your traffic stops by race and vehicle type." Patterson took a step back, his authority evaporating in the face of documentation, witnesses, and imminent accountability. But Sarah wasn't finished. This moment wasn't just about her. It was about every person who'd faced similar harassment without the resources or platform to fight back. "One more thing, Officer Patterson," she said, her voice now carrying an edge of steel. "Check your department email. The Oversight Committee's preliminary report was sent this morning. You might want to read it before tomorrow's meeting, particularly the section on pattern and practice violations." The gathered crowd had grown larger, their phones still recording every moment. Some were live streaming. Others were posting to social media. Patterson's abuse of power, usually hidden behind badge and bureaucracy, was being exposed in real time. And Sarah Johnson, the quiet doctor who kept to herself, stood at the center of it all. Years of preparation and documentation finally coming to fruition in one defining moment. The stage was set for confrontation, but not the kind Patterson was used to. This wouldn't be solved with intimidation or force. This would be fought with evidence, with witnesses, with the very systems he'd assumed would protect him. The next 24 hours unleashed a storm that had been brewing for years. As Sarah finally arrived at Memorial Hospital that morning, late for her first surgery, but supported by an understanding team who'd watched the incident unfold on social media, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. The videos were everywhere. #OfficerPatterson and #DerJohnson stands were trending locally. Channel 5 had already aired the footage on their morning news, alongside statistics about racial profiling that Sarah had been quietly compiling for months. But this was just the beginning. "Dr. Johnson." A nurse caught her as she scrubbed in for surgery. "There are 4 reporters in the lobby asking for you." And, she hesitated, "there are also 3 women who say they've had similar experiences with Officer Patterson. They want to know if you can help them file formal complaints." Sarah nodded, her surgical mask hiding a grim smile. "Tell them I'll meet them after my rounds. And contact Marcus at the ACLU. He'll help them document their stories properly." As she performed her first surgery of the day, a routine appendectomy that her skilled hands could practically do in her sleep, Sarah's mind raced ahead to the Oversight Committee meeting tomorrow. What had started as one confrontation was about to blow wide open. Her phone buzzed again during her brief lunch break. This time it was Detective Lisa Martinez, one of the few allies she had inside the department. Internal Affairs just pulled Patterson's dash cam footage from the past 6 months. They're also looking into 5 other officers from his precinct. "This is bigger than we thought, Sarah." Another message followed quickly. "Found something else. 3 complaints against Patterson were lost in the system last year. All black women, all driving luxury cars." Sound familiar? Sarah wasn't surprised. She'd suspected the pattern went deeper, that Patterson's behavior was symptomatic of broader systemic issues. What did surprise her was how quickly things were unraveling now that the spotlight was on. By mid-afternoon, her inbox was flooded with emails. 6 more women had come forward with similar stories about Patterson. The mayor's office was requesting a meeting. 3 civil rights organizations wanted her to speak at their upcoming events. The hospital board was expressing their full support for her actions. Local community leaders were organizing a town hall to discuss police reform. But the most interesting email came from Officer James Rodriguez, a rookie who'd been Patterson's partner during training. Dr. Johnson, there are things you need to know about Patterson's training methods, about what he taught us to look for, how he told us to handle certain stops. I can't be the only one who saw what was wrong. Maybe it's time someone spoke up. Sarah forwarded the email to Marcus at the ACLU, adding a note. The cracks are showing. Time to push harder. As she made her afternoon rounds, Sarah noticed the way other hospital staff looked at her differently now. There was respect there, yes, but also something else, recognition. She wasn't just their brilliant but quiet head of emergency medicine anymore. She was someone who stood up, who fought back, who had a plan. Dr. Johnson. It was Dr. Rivera, catching her between patients. Remember those cases I texted you about this morning? The ones with police roughness. 2 of those victims want to file formal complaints now. They said seeing your video gave them courage. Sarah squeezed her colleague's arm. Get them in touch with Marcus and pull their complete medical records. Every detail matters. By evening, as Sarah finally headed home, the story had evolved beyond a single traffic stop. Local news was running segments on racial profiling statistics. Social media was filled with similar stories from other Black professionals in the area. The Oversight Committee had moved tomorrow's meeting to a larger venue to accommodate public interest. But it was the text from her mother that hit hardest. Baby, I just saw the videos. I'm proud of you. But please be careful. Men like that don't like being exposed. Sarah took a deep breath as she pulled into her driveway. Her mother was right. This was the dangerous part. Patterson and others like him wouldn't go down without a fight. Already there were rumblings. The police union had issued a statement defending Patterson's right to conduct routine traffic stops. Some of her neighbors had started a counter hashtag claiming she was anti-police. Anonymous accounts were trying to dig up dirt on her past. There were whispers about officers deliberately slowing response times in her neighborhood. But Sarah had anticipated this too. As she settled in for a long night of preparation, she opened her laptop to reveal years of meticulously organized evidence. Spreadsheets tracking traffic stops by race, gender, and vehicle type. Video compilations showing pattern behavior. Statistical analyses proving discriminatory practices. Testimonies from other victims. Internal department emails obtained through FOIA requests. Medical records showing a pattern of injuries during arrests. GPS data tracking patrol car patterns in certain neighborhoods. A notification popped up. Someone had just leaked Patterson's complete service record. 15 years of complaints, most buried or dismissed. The wall of silence was cracking. Another text from Detective Martinez. Heads up. Patterson just went into emergency meeting with his union rep. Something about old complaints resurfacing. The chief is furious. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she began preparing her presentation for tomorrow's Oversight Committee meeting. Tomorrow would be about more than just one traffic stop or one officer. It would be about bringing hidden patterns into the light, about giving voice to years of documented abuse, about turning individual incidents into undeniable evidence of systemic problems. Her phone buzzed one final time. An unknown number. Dr. Johnson, I'm a surgeon in internal affairs. We need to talk. There's more to Patterson's story than anyone knows. Can we meet privately before tomorrow's hearing? The pieces were falling into place faster than even she had anticipated. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The real challenge would be channeling this momentum into lasting change. As she worked late into the night, Sarah thought about all the women who'd faced similar harassment in silence, about all the officers who'd looked the other way, about all the complaints that had disappeared into administrative black holes. Tomorrow would change everything, but only if she played it exactly right. The city council chambers had never seen a crowd like this. Every seat was filled, with people lining the walls and spilling out into the hallway. News cameras jostled for position. Social media live streams glowed throughout the audience like fireflies. Sarah sat at the witness table, her evidence organized before her in precise stacks. She'd arrived early, watching as the room filled with faces she recognized. The women who'd come forward with their own stories about Patterson. Community activists she'd worked with quietly for years. Fellow doctors and nurses from Memorial Hospital. Officers from various precincts, some supportive, others hostile. Patterson himself, seated with his union representative, his usual swagger replaced by nervous tension. At exactly 9:00 a.m., Committee Chair Diana Rodriguez called the meeting to order. Today's hearing will address allegations of systematic racial profiling and abuse of power within the department, specifically focusing on the conduct of Officer Michael Patterson and related departmental practices. Sarah's testimony came first. With methodical precision, she laid out the evidence. Statistical analyses showing racial disparities in traffic stops. Geographic data revealing targeting patterns. Financial impacts on victims. Health records documenting stress-related conditions. Video compilations showing repeated misconduct. But it was the flash drive she produced next that changed everything. Members of the committee, Sarah said, her voice steady, what I'm about to show you goes beyond individual incidents. This evidence reveals a coordinated system of harassment and cover-ups spanning multiple officers and supervisors. The room tensed as she plugged in the drive. The projector hummed to life, displaying an email thread that made several officers in the room visibly pale. From Patterson at dipt.gov. 2. Training_group_ the subject. Traffic stop guidelines. Internal only. Remember what I taught you. Look for the ones who don't belong in certain neighborhoods. High-end cars, wrong demographics. That's where you'll find your numbers. Keep the cameras off when you can. Write the reports my way and I'll make sure they stick. More emails followed. Training documents, text messages, internal memos, a complete paper trail showing how Patterson had systematically taught discriminatory practices to new officers, how complaints were buried, how evidence was altered. The Internal Affairs Sergeant Sarah had met with the night before stood up. Madam Chair, I can confirm the authenticity of these documents. Furthermore, our investigation has uncovered additional evidence of systematic misconduct involving multiple officers and supervisors. Patterson's union representative tried to object, but was drowned out by gasps as more evidence appeared on screen. Security footage showing officers planting evidence. Audio recordings of racist comments during traffic stops. Internal communications discussing quota systems targeting specific neighborhoods. Financial records showing suspicious payments to officers involved in cover-ups. Then came the personal stories. One by one, victims stepped forward to testify. Dr. Michelle Carter, neurosurgeon. He pulled me over 6 times in 2 months. Each time, he'd say my car was too nice for someone like me. Judge Patricia Williams. Even in my judicial robes, leaving the courthouse, I wasn't safe from its harassment. Professor Angela Thompson. He told me that educated types like me needed to learn our place. But the most damaging testimony came from Officer Rodriguez, Patterson's former trainee. It wasn't just traffic stops. He taught us how to make our reports clean, how to cover for each other, how to make sure certain complaints never made it through the system. And if we didn't play along, Rodriguez's voice cracked. Let's just say accidents could happen on patrol. Patterson, his face ashen, tried to leave the room. 2 internal affairs officers blocked his path. Sarah stood again, addressing the committee. This isn't just about one officer or one department. This is about a system that enabled and protected systematic abuse. The evidence I've presented today is already in the hands of the Department of Justice, the FBI's Civil Rights Division, and multiple civil rights organizations. She turned to face Patterson directly. You thought I was just another target, just another black woman you could intimidate. But every time you pulled me over, every time you harassed someone who looked like me, you were adding to the evidence, building the case against yourself. The committee chair's gavel cracked like thunder. In light of this evidence, I am immediately recommending the suspension of Officer Patterson and all named supervisors pending criminal investigation. Furthermore, but her words were drowned out by the chaos erupting in the chamber. Officers were being served with warrants. Reporters were rushing to file breaking stories. Community members were hugging and crying. Patterson was being led away in handcuffs, his police union representative nowhere to be seen. Sarah remained seated, watching it all unfold. This wasn't just about justice for herself or even the other victims in the room. This was about changing the system itself. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus at the ACLU. They're launching investigations in 3 other cities based on similar patterns. You've started something big. Another message followed, this one from Dr. Rivera. CNN wants to interview you. So does MSNBC. This is going national. But it was the sight of young black women in the audience, tears streaming down their faces as they watched justice being served, that told Sarah her years of patient documentation had been worth it. The system that Patterson represented was being exposed, not through violence or protests, but through meticulous evidence and unstoppable truth. The weeks following the Oversight Committee hearing transformed not just the police department, but the entire city's approach to law enforcement and racial justice. Within 24 hours of the hearing, Officer Patterson and 3 supervising officers were arrested on multiple charges including civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. The FBI's Civil Rights Division launched a full investigation into the department. The mayor announced the formation of a police reform task force, with Sarah appointed as co-chair. 17 officers were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The police chief resigned in disgrace. But this was just the beginning. Sarah's phone rang as she was finishing her morning rounds at Memorial Hospital. It was the Attorney General's office. Dr. Johnson, we've reviewed your evidence. This goes beyond one department. We're seeing similar patterns across the state. Would you be willing to consult on a broader investigation? She smiled, thinking of the additional files on her computer, evidence she gathered from other jurisdictions, waiting for the right moment. I think you'll find I'm already ahead of you. The media coverage was relentless. Black Doctor exposes systemic police corruption. How one woman's documentation brought down a police department. From traffic stops to justice. The Sarah Johnson story. Pattern or practice. A new era of police accountability. But Sarah was more interested in the changes happening at the ground level. At the police department, body cameras were now required to be active during all interactions, with tampering treated as a criminal offense. A new digital complaint system was implemented, preventing complaints from being lost. Training protocols were completely overhauled, with anti-bias training led by community members. Traffic stop data was made publicly accessible in real time. A civilian review board was given real power to investigate misconduct. In the community, other victims of police harassment began coming forward, their cases reopened and investigated. Community groups formed to monitor police activity and document interactions. Local businesses installed cameras facing the streets to capture police interactions. A legal defense fund was established to help victims of police misconduct. Regular town halls were instituted between police and community members. At the hospital, Memorial Hospital established a special unit to document and treat victims of police violence. Medical professionals were trained to recognize and report signs of police abuse. A partnership was formed with civil rights organizations to provide medical evidence in abuse cases. Other hospitals in the region began adopting similar protocols. Patterson's case became a watershed moment. He pleaded guilty to multiple civil rights violations and conspiracy charges. His conviction led to the reopening of hundreds of cases he'd handled. Former victims received settlements from the city. His training materials became evidence in police reform cases nationwide. But the most significant changes were more personal. Sarah began receiving messages from across the country. A young black woman in Atlanta. Watching you stand up to that officer gave me courage to file my own complaint. A police officer in Chicago. Your evidence made me look at my own behavior differently. I'm speaking up about what I see now. A medical student in Oakland. You showed us that our professional success isn't just for ourselves. It's a tool for creating change. 3 months after the hearing, Sarah stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., testifying before Congress about the need for national police reform. Her evidence had sparked investigations in 12 other cities, revealing similar patterns of abuse and cover-ups. This isn't just about bad officers, she testified. This is about systems that protect them, about policies that enable them, about a culture that looks the other way. But most importantly, this is about the power of documentation, of evidence, of refusing to be silenced. Back home, the changes continued. Traffic stops of minorities decreased by 67%. Civilian complaints were down 80%. Officer satisfaction actually improved under the new accountability measures. Community trust in law enforcement began to rebuild. 1 year after the traffic stop that started it all, Sarah parked her Mercedes in front of her house. Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor who once watched her suspiciously through curtains, was in her yard. Dr. Johnson, she called out, I owe you an apology. I was part of the problem, wasn't I? Always assuming, always suspicious. Sarah walked over to her neighbor's fence. The important thing is recognizing it and changing. That's what this whole year has been about. Later that evening, as Sarah reviewed files from other departments now under investigation, her phone buzzed with a news alert. Senate passes police reform bill, includes Sarah Johnson accountability measures. She set down her phone and smiled. One traffic stop, meticulously documented, had created ripples that were still spreading. But more importantly, it had shown others how to create their own ripples, how to gather their own evidence, how to stand up and speak out. The system wasn't fixed. Not yet. But the cracks she'd exposed were letting in light, and in that light, real change was finally beginning to grow.